She stood on that wooden platform like a piece of livestock. But what happened next would shatter every rule that Godforsaken Town had ever known. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the auction block as Ko trembled in chains. Her delegate. Hands were bound behind her back, and the thin cotton dress she wore had seen better days. The crowd below her jeered and shouted bids like she was nothing more than cattle to be sold to the highest bidder. "Do I hear $50 for this fine specimen?" The auctioneer bellowed, his voice slicing through the desert air like a whip. "Look at those hands. Perfect for housework, cooking, whatever else a man might need." The men in the crowd laughed with cruel satisfaction. Some stepped closer, their eyes glinting with the kind of hunger that made decent folks turn away. But this wasn't a town known for decent folks. Ko kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, trying to disappear inside herself. She had learned long ago that showing fear only made things worse. Her previous owner had died 3 days ago, and now here she was, being sold like his horse or his furniture. The law said she was property. The law said she had no rights. In the back of the crowd, a tall figure in worn leather stood perfectly still. Silas Blackwood had ridden into town for supplies, nothing more. His weathered face revealed nothing as he watched the spectacle unfold. Most folks knew to leave him alone. He kept to himself on his ranch 20 miles north. Never caused trouble. Never asked for anything from anyone. $60, shouted a heavy-set man near the front. "I got work for her at my place." More laughter erupted from the crowd. Ko's shoulders tensed, but she refused to look down at them. She had survived worse than this. She would survive whatever came next. The auctioneer raised his gavel. $60 going once, going twice. That's when Silas stepped forward. His boots made no sound on the dusty ground, but somehow the entire crowd sensed his movement. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the auctioneer paused with his hammer halfway to the block. $100, Silas said quietly. His voice carried despite its softness, one of those voices that belonged to a man who never had to repeat himself. The crowd turned to stare. In a town where most folks struggled to earn $20 in a month, $100 was a fortune. But more than that, Silas Blackwood never got involved in anything. He lived alone, worked alone, and minded his own business. The heavy-set bidder's face flushed. "Red, now hold on there, Blackwood. I was here first." Silas didn't acknowledge him. His dark eyes remained fixed on the auctioneer. $100 cash. For the first time since being dragged onto that platform, Ko looked directly at the man who had just bid for her. Something in his steady gaze told her this wasn't about ownership. This was about something else entirely. But as the auctioneer's gavel came down with a decisive crack, neither Ko nor Silas could have predicted the storm of violence that would follow. The moment Silas pulled out that roll of bills, the entire atmosphere shifted. What had been a cruel game suddenly became something far more dangerous. "Sold to Silas Blackwood," the auctioneer announced. But his usual enthusiasm was gone, replaced by a nervous uncertainty. He had expected the bidding to drag on, to squeeze every penny from these desperate men. Instead, he was staring at more money than he'd seen in months. Silas walked toward the platform with measured steps. The crowd parted reluctantly, their faces twisted with confusion and growing anger. He climbed the wooden steps and began unlocking Ko's chains with a key the auctioneer handed him. His hands were steady, gentle, nothing like what she had expected. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, his voice meant only for her. "Ko," she whispered, barely audible. He nodded once. "I'm Silas. When we get down from here, stay close to me. Don't run. Don't look back. Just stay close." But as they descended from the platform, the heavy-set man who had been bidding stepped directly into their path. His name was Crawford. and he owned the largest saloon in town. Behind him stood 5 other men, all armed, all clearly unhappy with how things had played out. "This ain't right, Blackwood," Crawford spat. "You don't even come to town except for supplies. What you want with a girl like that?" Silas handed the money to the auctioneer and gently guided K.O. toward his horse. "That's my business, Crawford." "Like hell it is." Crawford's hand moved to rest on his gun. "We all know you live alone out there. Ain't natural for a man to be alone all the time. Makes folks wonder what kind of man you really are." The crowd was growing restless. Someone shouted from the back about how outsiders shouldn't get first pick of anything. Another voice suggested maybe Silas had been planning this all along. Maybe he had some kind of arrangement with the auctioneer. K.O. could feel the hatred radiating from every face around them. These men weren't just angry about losing a bid. They were angry about losing what they saw as their right to do whatever they wanted to. Someone who couldn't fight back, Silas reached his black stallion and began untying the reins. His movements remained calm, but K.O. noticed his other hand now rested near his own weapon. "Step aside, Crawford. The auction's over." "No, it ain't." Crawford moved closer, and his men spread out to flank them. "See, I've been thinking. How do we know that money's even real? How do we know this whole thing wasn't set up? Maybe we ought to have another auction, just to be fair." That's when K.O. realized the true danger they were in. This had never been about money or fairness. It had been about power, about a group of men who enjoyed having complete control over someone else's life. Silas had disrupted that power, and they weren't going to let it stand. The auctioneer, sensing trouble, had already packed up his things and was backing away from the platform. Other townspeople were either joining Crawford's group or disappearing into buildings, unwilling to get involved, but equally unwilling to stand up for what was right. Silas finally turned to face Crawford directly. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "This is your last chance to walk away." Crawford laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that came from a man who had already decided violence was inevitable. "Or what? You gonna fight all of us for her?" As if choreographed, every man in Crawford's group put their hands on their guns. The few remaining spectators scattered, diving for cover behind water troughs and storefronts. K.O. found herself caught between terror and something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Someone was actually willing to fight for her dignity, for her right to be treated as a human being rather than property. But as she looked at the odds stacking against them, she wondered if Silas's act of compassion would be the last thing either of them ever did. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. 6 armed men against one, with an unarmed woman caught in the middle. Those weren't odds that any reasonable person would take, but Silas Blackwood had never been accused of being reasonable. "K.O.," he said without taking his eyes off Crawford. "Get behind the horse." She moved quickly, her bare feet silent on the dusty ground. From her new position, she could see the entire confrontation unfolding. Crawford's men had spread out in a rough semicircle, blocking any obvious escape route. Their hands hovered over their weapons, waiting for their leader's signal. "You know what I think, Blackwood?" Crawford's voice carried the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "I think you've been living alone too long. Makes a man soft. Makes him forget how things work around here." "How do things work around here, Crawford?" "Simple. We take care of our own, and we don't let outsiders come in and upset the natural order." Crawford gestured toward K.O. without even looking at her. "That girl belongs with someone who understands her place. Someone who'll put her to proper use." The way he said proper use made K.O.'s skin crawl. She had heard that tone before, had seen that look in men's eyes. It was the look that said she wasn't human, wasn't worthy of basic dignity or respect. Silas adjusted his stance slightly, And suddenly, he didn't look like a peaceful rancher anymore. There was something in his posture that spoke of violence held carefully in check, of skills that most folks never suspected he possessed. Last warning, Crawford. But Crawford had mistaken Silas's calm demeanor for weakness, his isolation, for helplessness. It was a mistake that would cost him dearly. The first shot came from Crawford's right-hand man, a wiry fellow named Pike, who had always been too quick to violence. His bullet went wide, striking the wooden post behind Silas's head. Silas moved like water, flowing around obstacles. His gun appeared in his hand as if by magic, and his first shot dropped Pike before the man could fire again. The second shot caught another of Crawford's men in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. K.O. had never seen anything like it. Silas fought with the precision of someone who had spent years learning how to survive against impossible odds. He used his horse as cover, rolling and diving, always moving never where his enemies expected him to be. But even skill has its limits. A lucky shot from Crawford grazed Silas's left arm, and red began to stain his shirt. Another bullet shattered the window of the general store behind them, sending glass cascading to the ground. Enough! Crawford roared, his own gun now drawn, pointed directly at K.O. Drop your weapon, or I put a bullet in her head. Silas froze. For the first time since the confrontation began, real fear flickered across his face. Not fear for himself, but fear for the woman he had just risked everything to protect. Crawford's grin was triumphant and ugly. That's better. Now, like I said, we're going to have ourselves another auction. And this time, ain't nobody going to interfere. But as Crawford savored his moment of victory, he failed to notice the small crowd that had gathered at the far end of the street. Word of the gunfight had spread, and not everyone in town agreed with his methods. The question was, would anyone be brave enough to act on their disagreement? Crawford's gun barrel pressed against K.O.'s temple, cold as winter steel. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, could see the twisted satisfaction in his eyes as he savored his control over the situation. Now you're going to learn, Blackwood. Crawford sneered. This is what happens when you stick your nose where it don't belong. Silas stood motionless, his weapon lowered but not dropped. Blood continued to seep from the wound in his arm, but his focus remained absolute. He was calculating distances, angles, possibilities, searching for any chance to turn this around. That's when old Doc Morrison stepped out of the crowd at the end of the street. The town physician was nearly 70, bent with age and carried no weapon except his medical bag. But when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had delivered half the babies in town and closed the eyes of their grandparents. Crawford, what in the hell do you think you're doing? Stay out of this, Doc. This ain't your concern. But Morrison kept walking forward, his weathered boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk. A gunfight in broad daylight becomes my concern, when I'm the one who'll be digging bullets out of folks. And pointing a gun at an unarmed girl? That's just plain wrong, no matter how you dress it up. Behind Morrison, other townspeople began to emerge from doorways and alleys. Not all of them, many, were too afraid or too aligned with Crawford's way of thinking, but enough to matter. The blacksmith, the schoolteacher, the widow who ran the boarding house. People with consciences that wouldn't let them stand by and watch this unfold. Crawford's confidence wavered for the first time. He had expected fear, expected compliance. Instead, he was facing something far more dangerous, the judgment of his neighbors. "This don't concern any of you?" he said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "A man defending an innocent woman concerns all of us," Morrison replied. He was close enough now that Crawford would have to choose between keeping his gun on K.O. or turning to face this new threat. It was exactly the opening Silas had been waiting for. If you were Silas, what would you do? Risk everything on one desperate move that could save KO, but might get you both killed? Or trust that the growing crowd would somehow convince Crawford to back down, knowing that men like him rarely listen to reason? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose, because what Silas decided next would determine whether courage or cruelty ruled this dusty street. The rancher made his choice in the space between heartbeats. He lunged forward, grabbing Crawford's gun, arm and yanking it away from KO's head. The two men crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, Crawford's weapon discharging harmlessly into the air. Crawford's remaining men found themselves facing not just Silas, but an increasingly hostile crowd. The blacksmith had picked up a heavy hammer from his shop. The schoolteacher held a rifle that looked older than Moses, but still seemed functional. Even the widow had appeared with a shotgun that suggested she knew how to use it. "Seems to me you boys are outnumbered," Morrison observed calmly, as Silas and Crawford wrestled in the dirt. "Might be time to reconsider your position." But Crawford wasn't finished. As he grappled with Silas, he managed to pull a knife from his boot, a wicked-looking blade that caught the afternoon sunlight. "You should have minded your own business," he snarled, raising the weapon above Silas's chest. KO didn't think. She snatched up a jagged piece of broken wood from the splintered storefront and swung it with every ounce of fury she had left. It struck Crawford's wrist with a sickening crack. The knife flew from his grip, clattering uselessly across the dust, and he let out a guttural sound of both pain and rage. That single desperate act shattered whatever grim spell had held the crowd paralyzed. Suddenly, everything erupted. People surged into motion, voices rose, and Crawford's men found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, disarmed in seconds. The wounded man Silas had shot in the shoulder was bleeding heavily now, his bravado reduced to pleas for help. He collapsed to his knees, clutching the wound and begging for medical aid. Crawford lay sprawled in the dirt, cradling his ruined wrist and staring up at KO with eyes full of unfiltered hate. "This ain't over, girl," he snarled, his voice thick with venom. "You think hiding behind him will save you? There's nowhere in this territory you can run that I won't find you." But his threats rang hollow now. The power had shifted. Everyone could feel it. Silas stood slowly, brushing dust from his clothes, as he looked around at the faces encircling them. Most of them were strangers' people he'd only ever nodded to in passing while collecting supplies. Yet they had stood up, not for him, but for what was right. In a world where cruelty often reigned unchallenged, that meant something. The question now was whether that courage would be enough to protect KO from the wrath that was sure to follow. Doc Morrison crouched beside the injured, his aged hands working with deliberate slowness. Any empathy he once felt was buried beneath a grim detachment. As he treated Pike's gunshot wound, his voice was quiet but sharp. "You're lucky Blackwood's a better shot than you are," he muttered. "Damn lucky he aimed not to kill. More mercy than you deserved." Crawford struggled upright, his body swaying with the weight of pain and humiliation. Rage boiled on his face, but the fight had drained from his bones. Too many eyes, too many guns pointed his way. He wasn't foolish enough to mistake the silence for safety. "This ain't legal," he spat, turning his glare toward the gathering. "That girl was bought and paid for. That makes her property. And you can't just take a man's property." Silas stepped forward. The pain in his arm seemed forgotten. His voice was steel-wrapped and calm. "The transaction's complete. She belongs to me now." The words left a bitter taste in his mouth, but he used their twisted laws against them, the only way he knew how. "And what I do with my property is my business." KO flinched. Even knowing the intent behind his words, hearing herself reduced to property again twisted something inside her. Every humiliation she'd suffered over the past 3 years echoed in that single phrase. But Silas wasn't finished. However, he continued, his voice rising above the murmurs, as of right, now I'm setting her free. She can go where she wants, do what she wants. She's nobody's property anymore. A hush fell across the crowd. Even the wind seemed to pause. Freeing a purchased worker was legal, but practically unheard of. Silas had just thrown away $100 more than most people made in months for the simple satisfaction of doing what was right. Crawford let out a bark of bitter laughter. You fool. You think freeing her changes anything? She's got no papers, no family, no way to earn an honest living. Give it a week, and she'll be back on that block or worse. His words landed like blows. K.O.'s breath hitched. He was right. She had nothing. No money. No skills that would open doors, only ones that made her a target. Freedom, without a way to survive, was just another kind of prison. Then Margaret Walsh stepped forward. The town's schoolteacher, known for her iron spine and sharp tone. Can work for me, Margaret said. I need help with the younger children, someone to assist with cleaning and meals. Silas turned to her, his voice low. And how long before Crawford and his friends come for you? Burn down your school? Run you out of town? Margaret blanched, but her chin lifted. Then what do you suggest? Before Silas could answer, a new voice sliced through the crowd like a whip. Well, what do we have here? Every head turned. Sheriff Dalton rode in slowly, his badge gleaming too bright in the sun, and his boots far too clean for a man who claimed to patrol rough country. Everyone knew where his true loyalties lay. Crawford's saloon kept his pockets lined and his conscience empty. Crawford's smirk returned, confident and vile. Sheriff, perfect timing. We got ourselves a situation that needs your sortin'. Dalton dismounted with lazy grace, surveying the chaos. Wounded men, broken windows, dropped weapons. His eyes lingered on K.O., then narrowed at Silas. Looks like trouble found its way into town, he said. Care to explain? This here's about stolen property and disturbing the peace, Crawford announced. Blackwood interfered with a legal auction, started a shootout, and now he's claiming he can just set purchased property free, like he's the governor or something. Dalton's eyes locked on Silas. Cold, hostile. That true, Blackwood? You stir up all this? Silas didn't blink. I made a legal purchase at a legal auction. What came after was self-defense. Self-defense? Dalton chuckled. The sound thick with scorn. 6 men against one, and you call that self-defense? Sounds to me like you came looking for trouble and bit off more than you could chew. Doc Morrison rose to his feet, blood still on his hands. His voice carried a different weight, one born of years, tending to this town's births and deaths. I saw the whole thing. Crawford and his men drew first, threatened an unarmed woman, started the shooting. Silas defended her, defended himself. Is that so? Dalton replied, feigning disinterest. Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen. Blackwood, you're under arrest for disturbing the peace and destruction of property. The girl goes back to Crawford until we get this mess sorted. Crowd stiffened. Hands hovered over holsters. But Dalton was ready. His pistol was already drawn, his stance screaming authority. Anyone interferes, they'll be charged as an accessory. That's a promise. K.O.'s heart plummeted. The fragile hope she'd clung to crumbled in an instant. They were taking her back, and this time there would be no rescue dot. As Dalton stepped toward Silas with iron cuffs, the rancher turned his head and met K.O.'s eyes. One word formed silently on his lips. Run. Her chest tightened. Run. But where? Barefoot. Dressed. In rags. No food. No map. She knew nothing of the land beyond this cruel little town. But staying meant a fate worse than F. As the cold shackles clicked around Silas's wrists, she moved. A step, then another. Backward, quiet. Invisible. The crowd focused on the injustice at the center of the square. No one noticed one small Japanese woman easing toward the shadows of the alley. Now, Crawford, Dalton was saying, you'll need to keep that girl secure till the territorial judge reviews the auction records. Can't have her wandering off. Crawford's eyes gleamed like an animal's. Don't worry, Sheriff. I got a real safe place for her. She won't be going nowhere. That's when Doc Morrison raised his voice again. This is wrong, Dalton, and you damn well know it. That man saved her from a fate worse than death, and you're throwing him in chains for it. The law is the law, Doc, Dalton shot back. Maybe Blackwood should have thought about consequences before shooting up my town. While this men debated law and justice, and who had the right to decide a woman's fate. They forgot about the woman herself. K.O. had reached the alley mouth. The shadows wrapped around her like an old friend. Years of servitude had taught her how to disappear, how to melt into corners when being seen meant being hurt. Pressed against the rough boards of a building, she listened as the arguments grew more heated. Margaret Walsh was now shouting. The blacksmith barked something about who drew first. Even a few of Crawford's old drinking buddies looked uneasy. But K.O. knew talk wouldn't save her. Not here. Not with Crawford pulling strings and Dalton holding the badge. Unless she vanished completely, she'd be back in chains before sunset. She turned to flee only to freeze as a shape blocked her path. Going somewhere, little bird? The voice was low, sharp, and cruel. Pike. The man Silas had shot in the shoulder. His arm was bound tight in blood-soaked bandages, but his eyes blazed with pain and vengeance. In his good hand, he held a length of coarse rope. Crawford figured you might try to run, he hissed, stepping closer. Asterisk, sent me to make sure you didn't get far, Pike said, stepping fully into view, his grin crooked and broken, a few teeth missing, making him look like a demon carved from spite and blood. Don't worry, he sneered, the rope in his good hand swinging lazily. I ain't gonna hurt you much. Crawford wants you in good condition for your new arrangements. K.O.'s breath caught. Pike was injured, his shoulder wrapped in rough, stained bandages, but he was still twice her size, still armed, and the alley behind her offered no room to slip past him. Running would be impossible. Fighting him would be suicide. Then, like a whisper from the past, her grandmother's voice stirred in her memory. A lesson taught long before her world had been torn apart. Asterisk, small streams can carve through the largest rocks, child. Not through strength, but through patience and finding the right weakness. Asterisk, Pike's weakness wasn't his injury. It was his pride. The humiliation he'd suffered, shot down in front of the whole town by a man he'd written off as nothing, was still raw and festering. He wanted to prove himself dangerous again, to remind everyone he still had power. You shot, K.O. said softly, eyes flicking to the bandaged shoulder. She tilted her head, voice dipped in feigned concern. Bleeding bad? Pike blinked, caught off guard by her sympathy. His chest puffed slightly, feeding off what he believed was her fear. Yeah, well, your boyfriend's gonna pay for that soon enough. Crawford's got plans for him, plans that'll make him wish he'd stayed out at. K.O. stepped a little, closer, careful, pretending curiosity. Plans? Oh, yeah, Pike said, voice dropping into something darker. See, them territorial prisons got a reputation. Accidents happen there. Guards don't watch too close when someone they don't like gets what's coming to him. He was enjoying the moment, savoring the power. K.O.'s stomach churned, but she kept her expression wide-eyed. Crawford's got friends in that prison. Friends who owe him favors, Pike said, leaning in. He ain't gonna die quick. They'll break him slow. K.O. let her eyes widen just enough. They kill him? Pike grinned, breath foul and hot against her face. Maybe. Maybe not. Depends how much fight he's got left after a few. Her knee came up with a snap, hard and fast, and it slammed into his groin with everything she had. Pike made a sound that was half groan, half choke, doubling over as pain overtook him. K.O. snatched a fistful of dirt from the alley floor and threw it straight into his eyes. As he reeled, cursing and blinded, she grabbed the rope from his loosening grip and took off down the alley at a dead sprint dot. His voice followed, hoarse and furious, but too winded to carry far. She heard him yelling for help, but his cries were broken, swallowed by the night. He wouldn't be sounding a proper alarm for several minutes dot, and several minutes was all she needed. She wove through the shadowy tangle of back alleys and collapsed. Structures where broken fences and crumbling walls told stories of a town that looked the other way. It wasn't safe, but it was familiar, the kind of place no one searched unless they knew exactly what they were looking for. But as she ran, Pike's words chased her harder than his footsteps ever could. Asterisk Crawford had friends in the Territorial. Prison. Silas was walking into a trap. Asterisk, a trap that would chew him up slowly. He'd saved her. He hadn't hesitated. Hadn't asked her to do anything. And now he was going to die because of it. She had her freedom now, at least for the moment. The question was whether she would use it to vanish or turn around and risk everything to save the man who had risked everything for her. K.O. crouched behind a stack of rotting lumber, lungs burning, chest rising, and falling like waves in a storm. Around her, the dark shells of old buildings stood like silent sentinels, temporary shelter. That's all this place could offer. Soon, Pike would alert the others, and they'd search every crevice until she was dragged back in chains. But her mind was fixed on Silas. She closed her eyes and saw him again standing on the auction platform, not flinching as the crowd turned, not backing down as guns were drawn. A man who stepped into fire because he couldn't let injustice pass him by. A man who had spoken only her name and told her to stay close. Now he was bleeding in a jail cell, marked for death, and she was the only one who knew what was coming. Voices broke through the stillness. Torches flared in the distance. Shadows moved with purpose. She could hear Crawford's voice, loud and sure, offering rewards and threats in the same breath. Bring her back, or you'll answer to me. Then she saw it. Behind an old saloon choked by weeds and forgotten memories stood a small wagon, half hidden in the brush, harness still attached to a tired-looking mule dozing in place. Someone had left it there, careless, thinking there was nothing worth stealing. In this part of town, they were wrong. K.O. crept toward it, silent and sure. She'd learned to handle animals like this. Had cleaned their hooves, brushed their coats, learned their temperaments during long years of silence and toil. The mule twitched an ear, but didn't spook as she climbed onto the warm wooden seat. The reins felt heavy and rough in her hands, but they felt right. The jail sat on the far side of town, built from thick stone with narrow barred windows. More crypt than courthouse. Getting there without being seen would be a miracle. But she didn't need a miracle, just timing. Just courage. She guided the mule through the winding arteries of the forgotten part of town, steering clear of Maine. Roads where torchlight bobbed and angry boots stomped, but getting to the jail was only step one. That place wasn't built for escape. It was built to keep people in. Even if she got close, what then? Guards, locks, no weapons. No way to overpower men trained to kill. But she had something else information. Pike's careless bragging had exposed Crawford's entire plan. They were going to make it look like a prisoner scuffle, a tragic accident, something no one would question. But that only worked if no one knew what to expect. K.O. had lived 3 years as a shadow. Tonight, she would use that skill to slip inside the cracks of their plan and break it apart. She stopped the wagon a block from the jail, tying the reins loosely around a post, and moved forward on foot, barefoot on dirt and stone. The shadows thickened near the stone building. Most of the windows were too high, too narrow. But the sheriff's office had one open, just a crack to let in the breeze. Voices carried through the night air. She crouched below the window, ears straining. Crawford was inside. Dalton, too. And at least two others. Their voices dripped with satisfaction. And whiskey. Transport leaves at dawn, Dalton said. Should reach the territorial prison by evening if we don't run into delays. And you're sure your friends there will handle it quietly? Crawford's voice was eager, slick with cruelty. Oh, they'll handle it, Dalton chuckled. Blackwood's gonna have himself a real and fortunate encounter with some of the others. Happens all the time. Prison's a rough place for men who don't know how to mind their place. K.O.'s stomach turned to ice. Even if she ran back and told the whole town, who would believe her? A woman with no name, no papers, no rights, against a sheriff and a saloon king who owned half the town? She needed more than words. She needed proof. Her gaze lifted to the window, just wide enough. The opening was small, but she was smaller and desperate. Inside, the men laughed louder. Make it look like you started it, Crawford was saying. Self-defense. Guards won't have no choice. What about witnesses? Asked a voice K.O. didn't recognize. Dalton's laughter was dry and sure. Asterisk, prisoners ain't exactly reliable witnesses. And the guards who ain't in on it. Dalton's voice dripped with smug certainty. They'll be told Blackwood went crazy. Attacked everyone in sight. Who's going to question that? K.O. had heard enough to chill the marrow in her bones. But she knew words alone wouldn't be enough. Not here. Not with this sheriff and his saloon lord partner owning half the town. She needed something no one could deny solid. Undeniable proof that could rip through the lies like a blade. And her eyes caught a glint of white fluttering. Just outside the window, an official-looking sheet, caught on a thorny bush beneath. The sill. It had the territory's insignia stamped across the top. If that had blown out, there might be more inside. Orders. Letters, something that could unravel this whole conspiracy if she could get her hands on it. The men inside were louder. Now their laughter steeped in whiskey and arrogance. This was her window. She moved like smoke silent, fluid and sure. The years of servitude had trained her well, teaching her how to disappear, how to walk unseen. Her bare feet made no sound as she slipped through the open window into the sheriff's. Dimly lit office, where the glow of a single oil lamp cast shadows that danced like spirits. On Dalton's desk, just waiting like an invitation from fate, lay everything she needed. Transport orders signed in the sheriff's hand. A letter from the territorial prison bearing the official seal. It's content enough to damn them all. It laid out in cold bureaucratic language exactly how Silas's accident should unfold. Names, timing, instructions, murder. Disguised as justice. Her hand reached for the documents, and her foot bumped a spittoon. The metal scraped across. The wooden floor like a scream in a church. The voices in the back cut off. What was that? Crawford's tone was sharp, all drunken cheer gone. Probably just the wind, Dalton answered, but his boots were already heading toward the office. Door. Kazo's fingers clutched the papers tight as she dove behind the desk, folding herself into the narrow space between it and the wall. Her breath caught in her throat as the door swung open. From her hiding spot, she could see Dalton's boots step into the room, the leather worn and dusted with grit. He stood there for a long, tense moment, scanning the shadows. Everything looks normal, he muttered at last, though his voice held a flicker of doubt. He stepped to the window, muttering again, and slammed it shut. Too many folks wandering around tonight for my liking. Only when he returned to the back did Ko move again. She emerged from behind the desk, documents still clenched in her hand. Her heart was pounding like a war drum, but her eyes burned with new fire. What she held was more damning than she'd dared to hope. The prison letter listed not only the plan, but the guards involved. Names, instructions, premeditated execution. But evidence meant nothing if it died in her hands. She needed someone who could stop the transport before it was too late. Someone with power. Then she remembered Judge Morrison. Not the doctor, but his older brother, the circuit judge due to arrive tomorrow for the monthly hearings. If she could get these papers to him, it might be enough to save Silas. But dawn was only a few hours away, and the transport would be gone before the judge's carriage ever rolled into town. She needed help. And there was only one person who had offered her kindness without expectation. Margaret Walsh, the schoolteacher who had spoken up when no one else had. Ko slipped back out the window and into the dark streets, weaving through alleys and past shuttered doors until she reached the zoo. Modest house behind the schoolyard. It stood quiet and still under the stars. She knocked softly, then firmer. Footsteps approached. "Who's there?" Margaret's voice came low and cautious, but not unfriendly. "It's Ko," she whispered. "The woman from the auction. I need help." The door opened at once. Margaret stood in the lamplight, wrapped in a hastily tied robe, her gray hair loose and wild around her face. "Good Lord, child, what are you doing here? The whole town's looking for you. I know, but I have something important." Ko held up the documents with trembling fingers. "Something that proves they mean to kill Silas." Margaret took the papers and read by the soft light, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, then to horror. "This is," she whispered, voice thin, "this is murder. Cold-blooded, premeditated murder. Judge Morrison." Ko breathed. "He comes tomorrow." "Yes, but not until afternoon," Margaret said grimly. "The transport will be long gone by then. Unless?" Ko asked, watching her carefully. Margaret stood in silence, weighing everything, the risk, the law, her role in this town. Finally, she looked up, jaw set. "Unless we stop that transport ourselves." The plan they crafted was reckless, dangerous, but it was the only hope. They had Dot as the horizon blushed with the pale light of dawn. Ko and Margaret stood by the roadside on the route leading east, where the prison transport would pass. Margaret carried her father's old hunting rifle, steady in her hands. Ko held the documents that could shatter the lies. The wagon appeared as the sun's edge kissed the sky. Sheriff Dalton rode up front, Silas shackled in the back, 2 armed deputies flanking the sides. Margaret stepped into the road. "Stop right there." "Dalton," she called, voice clear and unwavering. The rifle was aimed squarely at the sheriff. "We know what you're planning, and we have proof." The silence that followed was sharp as a blade. The confrontation that erupted was swift. Faced with a respected schoolteacher holding damning evidence, and Kaio's unwavering testimony, the deputies hesitated, then lowered their weapons. Dalton's smirk vanished. Crawford's name on the documents did what nothing else could. They, saloon man's connections, once his armor, became his chains. Now he was the one under arrest. Now he was the one facing transport. Silas stepped down from the wagon a free man, his wrists unshackled, his name cleared. But something more profound had shifted that morning. The people had seen what courage looked like. They had witnessed corruption fall beneath the weight of truth, and cruelty bend beneath the will of ordinary folk who simply refused to do nothing. Ko had come to this town in chains. Now she stood as a symbol of what could happen when dignity was defended, not just for oneself, but for others. 6 months later, Ko stood in front of a chalkboard, side by side with Margaret. teaching children how to read, how to count, how to dream. Silas had offered her a place on his ranch, a safe future, a home. But she chose differently. She chose to root herself here, in the very place that had once tried to break her. The auction block where her worth had been shouted and sold was gone now. In its place stood a garden, filled with the laughter of children, the rustle of books, the sound of hope taking root. It was more than a tribute. It was a promise that dignity, once fought for, once honored, could never be taken away again. Some said what happened was the story of one man's conscience and one woman's courage. But those who lived it knew the truth. It was the story of a town transformed, of what happens when good people decide that silence is no longer an option. Now, click the video on your screen to hear a story even more unforgettable, with a twist so powerful, it'll stay with you long after the final word.